They called them the pure ones, the chosen, servants blessed by the gods themselves. But if you could have stood in the shadowed halls of Egypt's temples in 1200 BC, you would have heard something the hieroglyphs never recorded, the sound of children crying. This is the story history tried to bury beneath layers of gold leaf and divine imagery, a story about what really happened to the girls who vanished behind temple walls and never came home. What you're about to hear is in mythology. It's documented in papyri fragments, administrative records, and desperate messages carved into hidden stones by hands that knew they would never be free. This is the truth about Egypt's temple virgins, and it's far darker than anything Hollywood ever showed you. Picture this, the spring of 1200 BC, in the great temple of Amun at Karnak. A 9-year-old girl named Nefertari stands trembling in a sunlit courtyard while priests circle around her like vultures. In their hands, they hold bronze razors that gleam in the morning light. Her father brought her here 3 days ago. He told her she was receiving a great honor, that she would serve the gods and make the family proud. But as the cold metal touches her scalp and her long black braids fall away in clumps, Nefertari begins to understand that something is terribly wrong. She starts to cry. The slap comes so fast she doesn't see it coming. An older priestess, her face hard as stone, strikes the child across the mouth. "Servants of the god do not cry," the woman hisses. "You have no tears anymore, no name anymore. You belong to Amun now, and Amun does not tolerate weakness." That moment marked the death of Nefertari as she knew herself. What began that day would last 43 years, a lifetime of confinement and control, hidden behind walls painted with scenes of divine perfection. But here's what sends chills down the spine of every historian who studies this period. Nefertari wasn't alone. She was one of thousands. Thousands of girls who disappeared into Egypt's temples, dressed in the costume of purity, but trapped in a system that destroyed them piece by piece. They carried beautiful titles: wife of the god, hand of the goddess, the pure one. But behind those sacred names was something that made Egypt's temples more prison than paradise. Most people today imagine Egyptian priestesses as graceful women performing elegant rituals, honored servants living lives of spiritual devotion. That image is a lie, carefully constructed propaganda that survived 3,000 years. Let's talk about what these women actually were. The most common term was Hemet Netjer, meaning servant or wife of the god. But that word wife should make your skin crawl when you understand what it really meant. These weren't volunteers. These weren't women who chose a religious calling. Most were children when they arrived, girls so young they couldn't possibly comprehend what was being taken from them. They came in 3 ways, each more disturbing than the last. Some families dedicated their daughters as religious offerings, either seeking divine favor or simply unable to feed another mouth. What was dressed up as piety was really permanent abandonment. The girl was handed over, and that was the end of her story as a free person. Others came as payment for debt. Egypt's temples weren't just houses of worship. They were economic powerhouses that owned vast lands, lent grain and silver, and collected what they were owed. When families couldn't pay, they paid with their daughters instead. It was human trafficking with a holy seal of approval, sanctioned by the state and blessed by the gods. And then there were the ones taken as spoils of war. Egyptian armies routinely captured people from Nubia, Libya, and the Levant. Among the gold and ivory and grain came girls, living tribute delivered to temples and absorbed into a system they could never escape. Let me tell you about Mutamoya. She was 8 years old when soldiers came to her Nubian village collecting tribute. She and 12 other children were tied together with ropes and marched north for weeks, hundreds of kilometers on feet that blistered and bled. Mutamoya didn't speak Egyptian. She had no idea where she was going. She cried constantly until a guard struck her and told her crying was forbidden. So she learned to cry in silence, tears running down her face while her mouth stayed shut and her body kept walking. When she finally arrived in Thebes, she was assigned to the temple of Mut, goddess of motherhood. The irony would haunt her for the rest of her life. serving a mother goddess while being denied any chance of becoming a mother herself. The process that transformed children like Nefertari and Mitamoya into temple property was designed with surgical precision to break them completely. First came the purification rituals. The child was brought to a sacred pool, stripped naked, and washed with water mixed with natron salt. But what the priests called cleansing was actually something far more sinister. These purification baths were inspections disguised as holy acts. Priests examined every inch of the girl's body under the pretense of ensuring ritual purity, touching and probing while claiming the gods required it. When Nefertari hesitated to remove her clothes, rough hands tore them away. The water was freezing. A priest stepped into the pool beside her and began touching her in ways that made her whole body shake with confusion and fear. When she tried to pull away, he grabbed her arm and said in a voice like ice, "The gods are watching. They are testing your obedience." So Nefertari stood frozen and endured, learning in that moment that her body no longer belonged to her. After the water came the razor, every strand of hair removed, officially for purity, but really to destroy identity. Hair meant beauty, individuality, pride. Without it, when Nefertari looked at her reflection, she couldn't recognize herself anymore. Then came the renaming. Her birth name, the one her mother gave her, was declared dead. The priest gave her a new identity. Nefert Nebet, beautiful is the lady. She was ordered never to speak her real name again. That name connected her to her family, to who she was before. Now it was forbidden, erased, as if that child had never existed. But the darkest ritual was still to come. They called it the divine marriage ceremony. If you think you know where this story is going, I promise you don't. What these so-called marriages actually meant, what happened in those inner sanctuaries behind closed doors, that's where this story becomes something history has tried desperately to hide. But those desperate messages carved into stone, those administrative records that survived by accident, they tell us everything, and what they reveal will make you see Egypt's golden temples in a completely different light. Because sometimes the most beautiful monuments are built on the darkest foundations. Sometimes what we call sacred is just another word for suffering no one wanted to acknowledge. And sometimes the people history forgot to mention are the ones whose stories matter most. The divine marriage ceremony. Even the name sounds beautiful, doesn't it? That's the point. 10-year-old Mutamoya was dressed in white linen so fine it was nearly transparent. Gold jewelry hung heavy on her small frame. She was led into the inner sanctuary where the statue of Mut towered above her in the darkness, barely visible by flickering lamplight. The high priest began chanting in the ancient sacred language, claiming these were the goddess's own words. He proclaimed that Mutamoya was chosen, blessed, destined to become the goddess's bride. Then he told her to repeat after him, "I give myself to Mut. My body is her temple. My life is her property. I will serve in purity and obedience forever." She repeated every word without understanding what they truly meant. That moment was recorded as a holy union, but in reality, it was a contract of ownership. A girl married to a god could never marry a man. That path was closed forever. She could never have children who would be recognized as her own. She was bound to that institution until death released her. But there was something even darker about these divine marriages, something in how the priests saw themselves. They didn't just serve the gods, they claimed to embody them. And that belief, that dangerous delusion of divine authority, opened the door to horrors that make your blood run cold. Life inside the temple was designed with one purpose: total control. Let me walk you through a single day in Nefertari's existence. She woke before sunrise in a dormitory packed with dozens of other women, sleeping under the watch of older attendants who'd been broken by the system decades ago and no longer remembered what freedom felt like. There was no privacy. Morning began with washing, then dressing in plain white linen that marked them as temple property. Then came the labor, weaving cloth, grinding grain, preparing offerings, cleaning sanctuaries. Hours that blurred into days, that blurred into years of monotonous work disguised as holy service. But what made it unbearable wasn't the labor itself. It was the silence. The women were forbidden to speak unless spoken to. Any unnecessary conversation meant punishment. That enforced silence was brilliant in its cruelty because it prevented connection, prevented friendship, prevented trust. They were surrounded by people, but completely alone. Nefertari had one friend, a girl named Takit, who worked beside her at the looms. Sometimes they whispered to each other, just a few words, just enough to remember they were human. One afternoon the supervisor noticed, without warning, without explanation, she struck Takit across the back of the neck with a wooden rod. Takit was dragged away while everyone watched. For 3 days she was gone. When she came back, something behind her eyes had died. She never spoke again, not even in whispers. 2 months later, she vanished completely. The supervisor simply announced that Takit had been found impure and returned to the gods. No one knew what that meant, but everyone understood, questioned nothing. Obey everything. Survive. The surveillance went beyond watching. Their movements were restricted, contact with families forbidden. And there were the regular inspections, examinations performed by priests to ensure ritual purity. These inspections were deeply invasive. Nefertari learned to send her mind somewhere else during them, to float away while violations happened to a body that didn't feel like hers anymore. If anyone showed unhappiness or resistance, punishment followed swiftly: extra labor, starvation rations, beatings. Escape was impossible anyway. They'd been taken so young they barely remembered life outside. They had no skills, no home to return to, no memory of freedom that felt real enough to chase. If this story is affecting you, if you believe these forgotten voices deserve to be heard, then please subscribe to this channel. Because mainstream history won't tell you these stories. Textbooks skip over the suffering hidden in the shadows of monuments, but here, we uncover what official records tried to silence. We remember the people behind the hieroglyphs. We don't let them disappear twice. Among the temple women, some held a special designation, wives of the god. They participated in rituals the inscriptions call sacred unions, ceremonies supposedly meant to reenact divine myths and ensure Egypt's fertility. The texts describing them are poetic, filled with metaphor and religious symbolism. But that beautiful language hides something monstrous. High-ranking priests, especially the high priest of Amun, claimed to physically embody the god during these ceremonies. They dressed in divine garments, performed elaborate rituals, and declared that their actions represented the god working through them. The women chosen for these ceremonies were told they were about to receive the god's blessing. They were brought into the inner sanctuaries and warned that resistance would bring divine wrath upon all Egypt. Then the priests, claiming divine right, enacted what they called the god's sacred marriage. Let's be absolutely clear about what that means. These were not holy unions. They were acts of coercion between powerful men and powerless women who'd been conditioned since childhood to believe their bodies belonged to the gods. When Nefertari was selected for her first sacred union ritual at 14, she was told that Amun himself would bless her. That night, led into the inner sanctuary thick with incense smoke, the high priest approached wearing an ornate mask. He instructed her to submit completely. She didn't understand until his hands reached for her garments. She stepped back instinctively. Other priests surrounded her, whispering that this was the god's will. The high priest warned that refusing was blasphemy, an insult to Amun that could doom all Egypt. What followed was recorded as a successful sacred union, but Nefertari knew what it really was. Violation wrapped in ritual, assault disguised as religion. Some women endured these so-called unions many times. Worse still, some conceived children. Those children were declared blessed, divine offspring. But they were living proof of what had been done to their mothers. Daughters were raised to serve the temple just like their mothers. Sons were trained as priests. The cycle fed itself, generation after generation. At 16, Nefertari realized she was pregnant. She was moved to separate quarters with other expectant women, all victims of the same system. An older woman told her gently, Don't hope too much. When your child is weaned, it will be taken. If it's a girl, she serve here like us. If it's a boy, the priests will raise him. You'll still belong to the temple, and so will your child." Nefertari gave birth to a daughter. For 3 brief years she held her, loved her, tried to prepare her for what was coming. Then the girl was taken to begin her own training. Nefertari returned to her duties, sometimes glimpsing her daughter in the temple corridors, but forbidden to speak, forbidden to acknowledge her. Watching her little girl undergo the same breaking process she endured was a torture worse than any physical punishment. What happened to women who dared resist was designed to terrify everyone else into submission. Some suffered what the records call dedication to the desert, dragged beyond the temple walls and abandoned under the burning sun without food or water. Death by exposure, slow and agonizing. One woman named Renetemheb stood up during a meal and shouted, "This is not holy. These men are not gods. We are prisoners." The hall went silent. She was seized immediately. Every woman in the temple was forced to watch as she was led into the desert and left there. The next morning they were brought to see what remained, her body already torn apart by scavengers. The high priest declared, "This is the fate of the impure," but Renutemheb's defiance planted seeds. Resistance survived in secret, meanings hidden in song lyrics, brief glances exchanged during prayers, tiny acts of rebellion like weaving errors that spelled out words, "I resist." Most temple women died within those walls after lifetimes of enforced service. When they died, they were buried in unmarked mass graves, their names deliberately erased. When Nefertari died at 52, her body was placed in a pit with 3 other women, no coffin, no funeral rites. Her daughter, now grown and serving the same institution, was forbidden to mourn. The order was simple: forget she ever existed, yet some refused to disappear entirely. In hidden corners, on fragments of stone, they carved final messages. "I was born free. They took that from me. Remember, we were people." And there was Mutamoya, the Nubian girl. 2 days before her death, she etched words into a dark chamber wall. "I came from beyond the first cataract. My mother's name was Menatori. I remember her voice. I never forgot who I was before they took me. This life was not my choice. If you find this, know that I lived, know that I remembered." Her message still whispers from the stone after 3,000 years. I existed. I mattered. Remember me. This is the truth Egypt's temples tried to bury. Thousands of women taken as children, exploited for decades, erased in death. Today tourists marvel at these temples' beauty, admiring pillars and carvings, rarely realizing the suffering that unfolded within them. But now you know. When you see those ancient walls, you'll see them differently. Behind the painted scenes of gods and kings were women like Nefertari, Mutamoya, Takhet, and Renetemheb. Real people who endured unimaginable cruelty and still found ways to fight back, even if only through scratches in stone. What do you think should be done with these monuments now that we know what they really were? Should history remember them as architectural wonders or as monuments to suffering? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and your engagement helps their stories reach others who need to know the truth history textbooks won't teach. The temples still stand, the stones remember, and now, so do you.